Morning, everyone. Or in Joe's case, Joseph Kanon, my conversational partner here this afternoon. Good afternoon. How are things in New York, Joe?
They're about to have thunderstorms and it's a little muggy, but it's, what can I tell you? It's what you've seen on television, empty streets and a different city, one you would not recognize.
I have seen pictures because, as you know, my brother-in-law lives in Chelsea, and I've had some dramatic pictures sent to us of empty streets, Times Square, Grand Central Terminal with nobody in it. And the cultural institutions that are closed are terrible. The Metropolitan Museum, the Metropolitan Opera, on and on.
I mean, most of the reasons that people come to visit are gone. And in fact, a lot of the reasons why those of us who live here are gone. So let's just hope they come back.
There have been some interesting studies, both about Paris and New York, about whether people who have gone elsewhere to shelter during this pandemic are going to seriously think about returning to the major cities.
I think everything depends on how long this goes on. If it really made a turnaround in the next few months, I think things would return to normal. If it doesn't, we're in for a sea change. People are going to feel differently about how they live.
I think that's very true. My husband had signed us up for our 30th anniversary to take this wonderful trip, round trip Christchurch, New Zealand, over to Australia, Tasmania, and to Antarctica. And Crystal just let us know that they were not going to make the cruise, which I had figured out ages ago. There's no real way that it's possible to send people ashore and bring them back on the ship without risking infection, let alone being on the ship. So you're a big traveler, I'm a big traveler. It's going to be a big change for us too, isn't it?
It hurts. I mean, the things that one enjoys, restaurants, traveling, going out, going to the theater, any of those things that are, the raison d'etre for New York being New York, if they don't disappear, they're certainly going to fundamentally change. It's been a while. I've been in this apartment under quote lockdown or quarantine or whatever we want to call it. That doesn't mean we can't take a walk in the park, which you do, but you do it in a mask and you keep the distance and all of those things that we're meant to do. I think on the whole, people have been very good about it, but it has been several months. This is since March. And I think Robin's getting tired of my cooking, so we need to do something different.
Well, I think both of us probably feel as though we're living in a science fiction novel that we never thought would be more, in fact, than fiction.
Right. On the other hand, one hates to complain at all because, let's face it, we're very lucky. We're still healthy. We're here. It's comfortable. The problem is that I'm used to going to work, getting out of the apartment and going to another place. In my case, it's the public library, which is where I've written all of my books. And Robin has a business at home, so she's used to home offices, but I'm just here now being tolerated. I've been relegated to the dining room table, which is where I'm now working. And boy, do I miss the library. I really miss getting out and doing.
I can certainly see that. Well, I have gone to my personal bookshelf and I have brought out 4 of your books. As you know, I'm a mad fan of your books and I have read you in real time. So I thought we could do a little traveling by talking about some of Joe's books, since we can't actually travel right now. The first one, I'll hold it up, is his debut novel, Los Alamos, which won, remind me, it was the Edgar, wasn't it, Joe, for Best First Novel?
Yep.
And it took us to Los Alamos, what year?
1945. It's the spring of 45. Before VE Day, which happens during the course of the events of the book. And it was important for me, the timing, because one of the things that fascinated me is that so many of the scientists on the Manhattan Project were emigres and people who were refugees from Europe. And for them, the moral imperative of defeating Hitler just superseded everything. There were not a lot of moral questions raised by these people about, should we be making this weapon? Should we be employed in working on the bomb? But after May 45, after the Nazis are knocked out of the war, then questions began to creep in. What are we doing here? How is it going to be used? What's our level of responsibility? And that to me was absolutely fascinating. I thought, okay, how do we feel if we're part of creating this enormous catastrophe, which is what was going to happen?
Well, as you and I have spoken, it's virtually impossible for people creating something like this not to want to test it. I don't know that they necessarily wanted to use it, but there was no way to avoid seeing if it actually worked after all that. And even the testing was rife with hazards and bad consequences.
And it was making that next step. I mean, I think so many of the scientists involved were intellectually stimulated. And I mean, many of them say these were the best years of my life. It was so exciting. I was with all of these other brainy people and we were crossing a frontier of science. The whole thing was important and wonderful. But they didn't go to the next step, which was who was supporting all this. And they were essentially doing piecework for the military. The military owned the bomb once they had made it, not the scientists. And they were going to test it and use it.
Very true. One of the other things I loved about this book is I've spent a lot of time, we have a second home in Santa Fe, but I spent some years in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and both those towns are architectural clones, even though the landscape of Oak Ridge and Los Alamos is dramatically different, chosen because of their extreme isolation so this project, Manhattan Project, could go forward. But I found it fascinating to go back and look at Santa Fe in your book, as opposed to the Santa Fe that I am used to with the Santa Fe Opera, the chamber music, kind of a world-class cultural center, big art capital. So it was a fascinating experience for me to read Los Alamos.
It was in those days a sleepy town. You know, there was a Rexall drugstore on the main square and somebody selling blankets, and that was about it. It was not the big tourist center that it's since become. But of course, the surroundings are still so beautiful. That never changed.
I'm going to move on here to The Prodigal Spy, which was your second book, and this is about Oppenheimer. I mean, you're interested in probing ethics all the time, aren't you? And, you know, I know that you like spycraft and thinking about it, but you also really like the ethical dilemmas or ethical issues that come up in books like this. And Oppenheimer is an amazing case.
I mean, I think that this is what books do. First of all, they entertain, and if somebody wants to read these books simply for the storyline or the plot and gets enjoyment out of it, that's perfectly fine with me. I'm not trying to throw ethical questions down anybody's throat. But I think exploring the way we live and the kind of moral decisions we make, and we're always making them all the time, you know, all of us. It's not just the Oppenheimers of the world who are thrust into this position of having to make really serious decisions. We're doing it too. And we're expressing whatever worldview and ethos that we have. I think that's what books explore, or at least they explore it for me. It's what I really enjoy in other books. So you hope to do it yourself.
Well, Oppenheimer was a controversial investigation and case. Did you come to any conclusions that might have differed from the obvious ones when you wrote the book?
No. Assuming that you mean by the obvious ones that he was railroaded, that Louis Strauss just had a real hate on for him. He had insulted some of the atomic establishment in Washington. I think what happened with Oppie is that having been on this, what I call enchanted campus, and having succeeded in this almost impossible project. I mean, people didn't start going to Los Alamos until early 1943. So we're talking about this, the full range of the Manhattan Project being done in 2 years. I mean, just building the housing alone, you know, is one of, if you've been to Oak Ridge, they were putting up hundreds of houses a day there. You know, it's really an extraordinary time. And I think having accomplished that and become internationally famous, there was a now celebrated cover on Scientific American that simply had a chair with Oppenheimer's pork pie hat on it, and everyone knew what it was. It was like Churchill's V sign. It was one of the symbols. But having that kind of international renown, I think he imagined that he would go to Washington and sit at the table and be influential in making decisions about what was going to happen to atomic energy. That's how it started, but that's certainly not how it ended. And he was, I think, much abused, trashed. I don't think that he was remotely disloyal. And I think he just got caught up in that whole McCarthy madness that was sweeping throughout the country then. But he was a particularly poignant victim, in my opinion, because he was so torn about his guilt over making the bomb in the first place. Not that he ever didn't do it, he did do it.
You know, it's hard for people to realize, or maybe not so hard in the present moment, what it was like to be under McCarthy, how truly crazy it was. And no matter how weird it is today, and it certainly is weird and divisive and horrible, the McCarthy era was in many ways more terrifying. I won't go into it because I don't want to be political, but I went off to Stanford in 1958, and my first big fight with my father, in fact, the only fight I ever had with my father was that I was washed down the courthouse steps in San Francisco in a protest. I think it was in 1960. And he was mad at me because I put myself at risk, not because I was protesting. And that was all right before Vietnam started. And I've often wondered if all of that turbulence of the 60s was not just, but was a reaction to the horrors of the 1950s.
In some part, that has to be true. You know, the McCarthy period itself, and I guess the high watermark is from the late 40s through 55, was a nightmare. And this was a time when to be accused was to be guilty, so that the smearing would go on. It's interesting now to reflect that one of the great players in all of this was Roy Cohn, who was, of course, the mentor to our current leader. But let's not go there because I agree with you, we don't want to make this political.
No, let's not do that. Let's move on, in fact, to The Good German. Now, Joe, was this the first book that took you overseas? Because you've only come back to the United States, if I recall, once more when you wrote your book about the Hollywood and you know, that long train trip. But the rest of your work has all taken place outside the United States.
Yeah, it just happened that way. That it was not intentional. I think that The Prodigal Spy, for instance, some of it is set in Prague, although a lot of it is also set in America. But after that, yes, I was captivated by Berlin when I was researching The Good German. And Berlin is a place that I keep coming back to. I am now, the book I'm working on now, as a matter of fact, On the Dining Room Table, is also set in Berlin, and it's the third one that I've set there. And I realized that without intentionally doing this, that it hits the historical changes in that city. The first one that you had just held up was The Good German, and that's set in 1945 during the Potsdam Conference. And it's really Berlin at its absolute low point. It's completely devastated. It's occupied by the Allies. People can't get pharmacies, drugs, food, and it's a real nightmare. It was in Germany called Stunde Null, 0 hour. And it was, to me, a very interesting period. And you know, the only industry at all in Berlin was the black market, and it was corrupt. It was, you know, hell on earth, but consequently wonderfully dramatic, and all kinds of things are going on. I described it once to somebody as the book seemed to me like there was, in all of Berlin, there was this enormous chalk mark of a victim on the wall. You know, if you go into a crime scene and they've made a chalk mark of a victim, but the victim here are millions of people, and everyone is somehow or another complicit in what has gone on, either actively so, or at least, or it's done in their name. And in this city of great crime, there is this immense crime in the background that everyone is having to contend with and come to terms with, even if it's to deny it or to avoid it. But it's there. It's that chalk mark on the floor that's not going to go away. Anyway, that was The Good German. And then the second book about Berlin was Leaving Berlin, which takes place during the airlift in 48, 49, which I think was another real turning point, because after that, the city separates and we really have the division between East and West. And I keep moving on up, and this is now the Wall novel. This is now set in Berlin in the early 60s, so the Wall has gone up, and we're now at the height of the Cold War. And I think I'm going to stop. You know, my wife once said that if you keep going chronologically, you might actually write a contemporary novel someday, but I think that would mean too many novels, so I'm just going to, we'll cool it out after this one. But it's just the most interesting city, and you know, many people love it for other reasons. It's great nightlife, you know, it's fun, it's lots of young people. that isn't what really appeals to me. I think in fact, I'm usually in bed by the time those clubs open. What I think is so fascinating is how the living history there just keeps coming out of the sidewalk. It's just everywhere you go, there's something that reminds you. And it was a serious history. It wasn't frivolous ever. It was a city that just kept rising and getting beaten back and then rising again. So it's inherently dramatic. I'm just fascinated by it.
I don't know if I told you that when last I was in Berlin, I insisted at staying at the Hotel Adlon because it's the quintessential hotel in Berlin if you're interested in history. I loved the Brandenburg Gate, and now they have turned it into a sort of son et lumière at night, a sound and light show, which is tremendously dramatic. And then we went to Potsdam because I felt like, having read The Good German, I needed to go to Potsdam and walk around. And it's kind of rural and bucolic now. It's not full of drama. And there's, if I remember right, there's a Russian village on the grounds of Potsdam. Can't remember why.
I think Dutch. But,
was it Dutch? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it had been a garrison town. When Frederick the Great lived in Sanssouci, most of his soldiers and his guards were out there. So it had always been a kind of conservative, military-oriented place. But now it's reachable by the subway. You just get on the number 7 line and you're there in 25 minutes. And it is removed. It's part of Berlin and yet another world. And I was just there recently, in fact, last February, before all of the lockdown started. I was in Berlin and walking the Glienicke Bridge, which is where the spy swaps were held, etc. And the fascinating thing to me, I mean, Potsdam is setting itself up to be a more tourist-oriented place than it used to be. There's a cinema museum, there's a museum. You can go visit the Stasi headquarters. It's got this very peculiar geography, though, because West Berlin is technically east of Potsdam, so that if you went to Potsdam, you would go west from West Berlin into East Germany. It's one of these very peculiar things. Whenever you look at the spies on the bridge being swapped, they're kind of headed in the opposite directions of where you expect them to be going, given that it's an east-west swap. Because it turns out that to get west, you have to go east. It's like a conundrum. I'm not going to keep going with it, but it's one of those things.
I was fascinated. At the bridge, there's a tour. You can sign up to have a guided tour through Potsdam, which if you go by subway and don't have a car, is a really good idea. And of course, you do go to the bridge and you see the movie moment and think about it and all. But then we went on to Sanssouci, and on that particular day, the palace was closed. But what was open, which I thought was completely fascinating, was its conservatory, hothouse, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. And inside that were, I think, a better recall of imperial life. There were rooms that were furnished, and it was an interesting juxtaposition of growing things and living in an elegant way. That because Berlin was actually not that major a city for much of its history. It's really the 20th century that made Berlin a big city, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Berlin had been a backwater, a very small place. Yes, the Hohenzollerns made it a sort of Prussian capital, but it was still provincial. Its rise to world-class city, Weltstadt, is essentially on the same trajectory as Chicago's was, curiously enough. I mean, the dates are very interesting about the population boom in both those cities and the kind of industries that were pouring in. Berlin was uniquely an industrial capital, much more than, say, Paris. And you can still see it now. I mean, one of the reasons that they have this kind of techno nightlife is that there were all these old industrial installations in the city that were empty, that nobody was using them. And so there was a lot of space to use up. But when you go to Sanssouci, what you're seeing is particularly Friedrich's era, but it's the 18th century. It's Prussia at its most European. Voltaire comes and I think spends 2 years. He came for a weekend and just wouldn't go home. So, and Frederick enjoyed having him, so that was all very nice until they had a falling out, because people always had a falling out with him. But as you go around the grounds, it's essentially Friedrich's attempt to have a Versailles. And it was going to be glamorous. There was the orangery. There was another, I can't even remember the name of the building, but there are several palaces. It's not just Sanssouci. And you can easily spend a whole day walking from one to the other. And just the grounds are really pretty. It's very much worth going to. Do you think that during the lockdown, we're all so travel hungry that we think about this and say, oh, if only we could get on a plane and go to one of these places, it would really be a joy. However,
Yeah, I'm grateful for the memories, Joe. I'm into, for example, the trip I mentioned to you earlier would have been our 4th trip to New Zealand, and I'm grateful for the 3. And it's nice to replay visits to a lot of these in my mind. It is the Orangery that we went to visit. I couldn't think of the word, not the conservatory. But what I found really interesting also about Berlin, and I don't know if you've encountered it, but my husband, the restaurant dowser, you know, who manages to find every great restaurant in every city we go to, his food is his thing. The 3 restaurants we went to, there was one that we ate in the hotel, and then we ate in a very German restaurant nearby, sort of a rathskeller thing. The other 3 we went to, in every case, our waiter was from Brooklyn. And I finally, at the end of it, said to the last one, at the last restaurant, what's with the Brooklyn thing here? And he said, well, Berlin is so much like New York and Brooklyn, but it's so much more affordable that many of us have come over here to live and work because we can't afford to stay and work in Brooklyn and New York.
that's true. I mean, I think they pride themselves on being edgy and young. And there was a mayor of Berlin at one point about 10 years ago who said, we're happening, but we're poor. We need some cash infusion from the government. They had, this was a city that had, because of the East-West divide, there were 2 operas and 2 symphonies and art museums on both sides. Now, since unification, all of that has been combined, but it's still, a great cultural center. The restaurants are okay. I mean, I don't think anybody has ever made a pilgrimage to Berlin just to have the food, unless you really like a great Wiener Schnitzel, and who doesn't, so that's all fine. But it's an exciting city to be in because there are so many young people and because people can afford to be there. I mean, even ourselves as tourists find it a much easier go than, say, London or Paris.
The other great reason to go are the museums. I mean, you go to the Pergamon, and that's where you see the Ishtar Gate. You go to I'm trying to remember whether it's the Altus or the other museum, and there is Nefertiti, that magnificent bust that you are just mesmerized by, and she's behind glass. But I stood there and stared at her for hours. And also, I was totally disillusioned at another museum to discover that most of Heinrich Schliemann's discoveries at Troy, however you authentic or not authentic you want to think of them, but anyway, the Trojan gold, almost all of it is in Russia because they took it away, when the Russians came into Berlin. So it is a city that combines so many amazing things to do. I would like to go back, you're right, because a lot of it was under construction too while we were there. Have they finished that whole subway thing that had much of the city torn up?
Yes, it's the one that's now under den Linden, and they've almost completed the palace. They rebuilt it, and with the same facade. I'm not sure that was so wise, but anyway, they did, and now they've made yet another cultural center there. So, it's fine. I love coming back every few years just to touch base and to see what's happening to it, because it is a city that's gone through such fundamental change in our lifetimes. I mean, there are other cities that we go to where the whole draw is the fact that they never change at all. I mean, I adore Venice and Istanbul. But if you go to the old section of Istanbul, the great appeal is that it looks the way it would have looked 50 years ago. In fact, when I was writing the book that was set in Venice, I realized that on some level it was the trickiest of all of them to write, because you really had to get everything correct. You have a sort of wiggle room when you're writing about Berlin because things have been destroyed and names changed and all that business. But if you have somebody walking down a calle in Venice, you'd better have them go in the right direction, because 50 million other people have been on there and they know where it ends and they know where it's leading. So you have to get it right. So you were holding up Istanbul Passage.
I am holding up this. I have to tell you, I've loved all your books, but this one is the book of my heart, probably because Istanbul is the city of my heart. If I wanted to go back, and I can't because it's changed too much since our earlier visits to Istanbul under Erdogan. It's not the same place. It may be geographically the same, but it's not actually the same. But I love this book as a chance to revisit Istanbul. But also, Joe, this is a book that I felt you did a magnificent job in talking about what happens to people who've been caught up in the war, who have, you know, given their all, their adrenaline's been high, you know, it's king and country, or in America, the American way, whatever you're fighting for, and then it's over. And what happens to emerge from war life into real life without any real clear sense of direction? And I thought is that what interested you in writing that book?
Yeah, very much so. That and the city itself. But I think that phenomenon interests me in general. You know, it's not like a tap that you just turn off. If somebody has been involved in a war for 5 years, you don't just say, oh, it's over, now everything returns to normal, because it doesn't. And your head is in a different place, not to mention all of the whatever chemicals are racing through your bodies if you've been involved in some of that wartime excitement. And here we have a guy who had been on at least the periphery of a kind of espionage unit there, but who loved doing it, who really thought it was exciting, gave his life a kind of center and purpose. And now all of a sudden everybody's going home. Nobody's interested in being in Istanbul anymore. I had found, you know, the reason, this was almost the classic example of how my books begin. Because Robin and I were there, well, I had always wanted to go just as a tourist, and went there, fell in love with it the first day, which isn't unusual because everybody does, and read everything I could about it. And every time I read about it, it would end with Ataturk in the 20s and 30s. And I thought, but what happened after? What happened during the war, which is that period that I'd written about and interested me? So the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this was almost my ideal setting. It was the true Casablanca. This was a listening post for practically every espionage unit, right on the border of the active war. It was a neutral city, but the war is 20 kilometers away. So naturally a great Rick's Cafe kind of atmosphere. You know, you go, I read about a scene which I then use in the book, when you go to the Park Hotel and everybody there is working for somebody and everybody's involved in skullduggery. And I thought, this is great. This is absolutely the real thing. Plus it gave me an excuse to go back to Istanbul. So I kept going back and back. You know, when I say I'm researching, I'm not in archives reading Osman's letters in Turkish. I'm usually just walking around the city and trying to figure out where the characters live, where the office would be, could they walk, would they take a tram, where was a desirable neighborhood in 1945. I mean, you want to get the period details right, but you don't want to be driven crazy by this. And I think what happens is that you either develop a feel for a place or you don't. I fell in love with that city. I just thought it was one of the most interesting places I'd ever been, plus beautiful. I mean, nobody would claim Berlin is beautiful. It's fascinating, but not necessarily pretty. But Istanbul, to me, is almost as if you took the archaeology and history that is Rome and the hills of San Francisco and kind of mash them up together, and you get some incredibly beautiful stuff going on. So I enjoyed going back. That was fun.
The landscape and the geography of Istanbul are certainly wonderful. Also, if you go there and spend any time, well, let me say that we stayed the first time at the Para Palace Hotel before it was renovated, so it was fiendishly uncomfortable. But it was an interesting, we overcame that because on one floor, I think it's the fourth floor, they have preserved Agatha Christie's room because she stayed there writing some of her novels that came to Baghdad and so forth. And then down below on the main floor, they have preserved the rooms of Ataturk. So you had these two iconic figures, both of whom had hung out in the Para Palace Hotel, but were so entirely different. But the other lesson I learned, you know that better than I, is that history is written by the survivors, by the winners, but it's also a point of view. And I am from the Western point of view, spent a lot of time in Australia and New Zealand, where Gallipoli and that entire tragedy for them is such a loss, you know, such a tragedy, such a defeat. But when you are in Turkey and you listen to them talk about it, it was their George Washington moment. It was their, you know, the moment at which Ataturk became, in fact, Turkey's George Washington. And so their view of Gallipoli is entirely different than the Western view of Gallipoli. And that was a really good lesson as a history buff to learn.
Unfortunately, their view about what happened to the Armenians is very different than the Armenians too. So that's one case where there's a kind of tragic element to this disconnect that people have about themselves. Nevertheless, well, I mean, I'm glad you love the book because it's always been a favorite. It was a pleasure to write. I mean, not every book is the same, but it was one of those where you inhabit in your head a place, and once that happens, you're off and running. You just, you know, you feel the city, you feel, I often say to people, you know, if you have a character walking down the street, the reader doesn't have to see everything he sees, but you as the writer have to see everything and just put in the one or two details that will make it come alive for the reader. You don't want to do a travelogue or a description, but you should know what he's looking at and what he's seeing. So it was a joy to write.
Do you remember the email exchange we had? I wrote to you because I saw the book was coming and I wanted to know whether we could set up an event. And you answered my email sitting out on the balcony of the restaurant in the Museum of Modern Art in Istanbul, which is on, you know, has a wonderful view back across the Bosphorus of the old city. And that was one of my favorite places, be in Istanbul. So it was one of those wonderful moments. But it seems to me, right up until the moment, most of the time when we've emailed and so forth, you've been in somewhere else. You've been in Argentina, you've been in Istanbul, God knows. And, you know, so I've kind of tracked your travel over all this time. And I can really imagine how hard it is for you to be sitting at your dining room table.
Yeah, but we mustn't complain, right? Or what did they say during the Blitz? Mustn't grumble, mustn't grumble.
Yes, the British were very strong. I'm going back to the good German for a moment. I have to say that Rob and I queued up the movie not too long ago because we thought it would be a wonderful return to Berlin. And it wasn't my favorite movie, although you'd think it would be with George, I think it's George Clooney, isn't it? Isn't
George
it?
Clooney, Kate Blanchett, Spielberg, Soderbergh directing. Everything should have been wonderful. But everything wasn't. And on the other hand, you know, I mean, it's my experience that writers almost never like movies that are made from their books because they've already made the movie in their head. And so it seems very different. So I made it a rule never to complain or criticize the movie. In fact, I hope it becomes a cult classic. There are a few people who will buy it. But yeah, it was a disappointment because the talent going into it was so perfect. I mean, they could not have been improved upon. And the one up about that film for me was that I was at that point when they were making the movie, I was researching the book that would become Stardust, which was about Hollywood during the McCarthy period. And one of the reasons Soderbergh wanted to make this movie is that he wanted to make a studio 40s movie. And he wanted to use the same camera lenses they would have used then, and sound stages and backlot, and use the same kind of technology. It was almost an auteur experiment for him to do this. Unknowingly, this was on his part, this was perfect for me because what I got to do when I visited the set for a few days was literally watch a 40s movie being made the way it would have been made in the 1940s, which is what I was writing about in the next book. So I will always be grateful for that kind of research. I mean, you can't imagine how accurate that all was.
The last book, or the most recent book, you flew out here, in fact, and we did an event for The Accomplice, which took you to Argentina. I was so glad that we did that, particularly now, looking back to realize that your timing was great to publish it in November and, let's say, April of this year, when we wouldn't have gotten to see you. What took you to Argentina? What was so fascinating about that?
It was really about the Nazi war criminals who had escaped there. I mean, I think Buenos Aires is a very interesting city and in many ways a gracious and beautiful one, but it was not a city that captured the heart the way Istanbul did or Berlin. What really caught my interest was the complicity of the Peron regime in helping these war criminals, actively interfering and hiding them and recruiting them. And I thought, this is just an appalling history. This is something that I didn't know that much about. I mean, we just assumed that a lot of people ended up in Argentina or Bolivia, and there's an end of it, you know, or they were making clones, as the movies would have it, etc. And I thought, but what was it really like? How did they get there? I mean, who helped? How did they get out of Europe? How did they arrive? And once they were there, what was it like to be living that lie? Were they in a German community? Did people care? Did they know? And all of these questions. So what really began to fascinate me about Argentina was simply their role in hosting and nurturing these Nazi war criminals. I had been there, and in fact, I went back when I knew I was going to set the book there. But on the first trip, it was a trip that included Buenos Aires and Brazil, and I have to say that Rio was a lot more exciting to see than Buenos Aires. And they each of them have this rivalry. It's that, you know, in Rio, people think that Buenos Aires, porteños, as they're called, are snooty and, you know, above it all and very European, because it was a big immigrant culture from white Europe, and there had never been a slave culture, so there's not the kind of racial mix that you get in Brazil. And indeed, there's a kind of, we look down on you, and the others say you don't know how to dance. I mean, it's one of those kind of cliche rivalries that goes on and on. And if anything, if you're going to write a book, Rio is sort of more fun to go back to, and it has a lot of dramatic things happening. But Buenos Aires had the Nazis, and it had, I came to like it a lot. I mean, I went back a few times, and it's, you know, one of the cities I'm glad it came into my radar, because otherwise I never would have done it.
My own feeling about Buenos Aires is it's much like Vienna. There's a certain grandiose quality to a great deal of it. But then interestingly enough, you've got the tango culture, some gaucho culture and so forth that prevails. I don't know how much it has changed, but what I've always thought interesting, if you happen to go there by ship, which I have done, is that the first place they want to take you is the Recoleta Cemetery, so that you can observe the mausoleum of Eva Perón. And I often wonder what that says about them, as opposed to, say, taking you to a museum or cultural center. And there's kind of a bubblegum pink palace, if I remember.
Yes.
So there's a very nice hotel, though. I think it's the Alvear Palace, where I've had tea a couple of times, and some very high-end and shopping. But I never could warm to Buenos Aires as I have to Rio or Santiago or some of the cities in Peru where I've been several times. Cusco. Lima doesn't have actually a huge heart, because everybody's kind of come down from the mountains and the villages and all and swarmed around Lima. And I was interested when we were there that somebody in Cusco, an historian that was talking to us, pointed out that the Revenge of the Incas was to have recommended Lima to the Spaniards as the perfect place for the capital, because basically it's a mosquito marsh and largely uninhabitable. The Incas were too smart to live there. They lived up in the mountains. So, you know, South America is just a fascinating place to go. And
it's one of those anomalies of history, the whole thing with Lima. I mean, the Spaniards were mad. They insisted that all trade go through Lima because it was the capital of New Spain, which meant that if you were in Buenos Aires, which was the natural port on the eastern side, you either had to carry goods overland, which would mean carrying them through the Andes, or you would have to go around the Horn. The whole thing was nuts. And so what happened, of course, is that Buenos Aires became a huge smuggling city. And that kind of contraband trade entered into its lifeblood very early on. Then, of course, the cattle came in and, you know, they had their great boom. You know, it's curious that you say that about Vienna, because I agree. There's this peculiar quality where it's got imperial buildings without ever having had an empire, you know, so that they seem slightly out of place there. As for the cemetery, by the way, it is far and away the biggest tourist attraction. I can't think of another city where that's true. And there's a whole chapter in the book, which I sat there and I decided I'd spend a whole afternoon kind of working out the sight lines and how this would happen and that would happen, etc. It was a lot of fun. And I thought, this may be the only book you ever write set in a cemetery. I hope so. Anyway.
It's been wonderful to tour around the world with you, Joe. I'm assuming you're never going to, well, maybe you will set a book someday in New Zealand or Australia or Tasmania, those places that I was heading at the end of this year before all this happened. And again, that's one of my favorite things. You can tell from this conversation, I'm always drawn to cities and cultural attractions. I'm a museum junkie, and so is my husband, the restaurant junkie. But we're also really drawn to landscapes. We love wild landscapes. And it's just, it's hard to give that up at the moment. But through books such as yours, at least we can go back and revisit them.
Well, you actually have the great good fortune of living in and near what I considered the great landscape in America. I mean, I think the Southwest is just stunning. And if you take, I think it's Route 12, if you take that drive through southern Utah, it's just one wonder after another. It's, I think, the most sublime landscape I've ever seen. And I have spent time in Mongolia, so it isn't just that I go down to the village or Soho, you know. I've been around, but there's nothing like the Southwest. It's really extraordinary. But if we're thinking about a place to go, ironically enough, given what's just happened in the last few months, one of the places that I'm seriously considering writing about is China. So, but I don't think I'll be going back there in the immediate future. It's a little
probably
risky.
Not. No, probably not. So don't go away. I'm going to stop the video, but I want to say thank you very much for joining me. It's lovely. We're going to post this as one of our book chats. So it's been a lovely conversation, Joe. Thank you.